We all know that the right habits and mindsets can be transformational in how we live our lives. But among the sea of advice online, it can be challenging to know who to trust with these important life decisions. At The Standard, we answer those questions and introduce you to some of the most successful people in the world in their fields and the habits and the mindsets they use to achieve their success. To learn more about our social platform, head on over to www.thestandardapp.com. And now, your host, myself, Chris Palatroni. Welcome to another episode of The Standard. I am your host, Chris Palatroni, and today's guest is Lindsay Mitchell. I've known Lindsay for a couple of years. I reached out to her when I was first building the Standard platform, and she was so kind to share a few of the habits that really support her mental health and wellness. And so I was excited to have her on. And as you'll see, if you watch this on YouTube, but you'll certainly hear it on Apple and Spotify, she has got such an infectious aura about her. She is wicked smart. She is a nervous system coach helping people deal with chronic illnesses. And in this particular episode, although she shares a little bit of rewiring your brain and neuroplasticity and all those things that we should all be paying attention to when it comes to dealing with stress and anxiety, we talk about her best habit, which is setting the intention in her morning and why she does that to be a better communicator with her partner. And we also get into her best mindset, which deals with integrity and showing up and learning about who you are and your values. And so a lot of fun conversation here, wicked smart. And without further ado, I want to welcome Lindsay Mitchell. Yay. Well, thanks for coming on today. I really do appreciate it. You've shared a couple videos on the Standard. I've really enjoyed making this podcast because I've had the luxury of bringing all these cool people I've met around the world. All of them are coaches and various things from yoga to fitness to nutrition to holistic health, and really just sort of picking their brain a little bit as to like, what do you do and why do you do it? Like, what's the most fundamental habits and mindsets for you? And so we'll get into that in a minute, but a lot of these listeners won't know your background maybe quite the way that I do. And so I'd love it if you could just take a couple minutes and just share a little bit of maybe your backstory and then what you do as a professional. That might give a little bit of context to this conversation.
Yeah. So I describe myself now as a nervous system coach, and I work with people who have chronic illnesses and chronic symptoms like fatigue, pain, brain fog, dizziness, a lot of symptoms related to chronic illness like chronic fatigue syndrome, Lyme disease, MCAS, multiple chemical sensitivities, like a lot of these more kind of chronic ambiguous diseases. But I also work with people who have chronic stress. And I focus on the nervous system in particular. So my background is working in an internal medicine, and I was an internal medicine practitioner and, worked around the world and saw a lot of patients with very similar symptoms, right? These kind of like chronic conditions. And at the time, my background, my training is Western medicine, and that's how I treated them. And then I got sick with a chronic illness. So I was traveling and I had been exposed to like mold. I was bitten by a tick. I had just kind of gotten to the point of burnout in my body. And then I started to get chronic migraines, joint pain, daily fatigue, anxiety, which I had never gotten before. And I knew something was wrong. And so I went kind of down the Western route, but came across like a lot of roadblocks. That was my training. And I tried the, antibiotics and antiparasitics, for Lyme disease, and tried a lot of detox therapies and even went the integrative and more holistic route. But I wasn't feeling better. And part of me was like, okay, I'm mid-20s, like I should be feeling better. Why isn't my body like getting out of this inflammatory response or fighting this infection? Why am I still symptomatic after all the treatments? So I done a lot of treatments and stuff over a period of months and started to learn about the limbic brain, the limbic system, and the communication between our brain and body. And something that I came across like on a blog post somewhere was that when we are dealing with a chronic illness, like a bacterial infection or a viral infection, our bodies go into this state of fight or flight, and our limbic brains, our feeling, reacting brains, go into overdrive and respond in the way that our nervous system is really like the communication between the brain and the body. And our nervous system responds like a threat is present because a threat is present. But it continues to respond in that way. And so we're constantly getting this message of threat, 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 and survive, 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 which causes hyperinflammation, hypervigilance, hyperreactivity. And it can be because of like a real threat, like a virus, or it can be or a real like physical threat, or it can be like a mental or emotional or psychological threat, maybe an experience of a traumatic event that we replay over and over in our heads. Our brains and bodies don't distinguish between real and perceived. So it's constantly like getting that communication to survive, and it does some wear and tear on the body. The body is like constantly reacting, and then that's when you start to notice like sensitivities to food and your environment and smells, and then being in a social setting, and your body starts to respond with inflammation, or your heart beats faster, your hormones start to dysregulate. So the body's so impacted by this survival response. And so that's what was going on with me. That's what I got out of the article. I was like, my mind was blown. I was like, this is incredible information. But I learned it. I started to learn more about it. And I read some books and started to apply some techniques and learned about brain retraining and the autonomic nervous system, kind of a lot of these buzzwords that are kind of trending nowadays. And I started to apply the information to a lot of the symptoms I was experiencing. And within about a year's time, I went from at a point to being completely bedbound, like not being able to lift my hand over my head to wash my hair because of just extreme joint pain, to surfing on the beach in Costa Rica and like eating a piece of pizza, like full gluten, full dairy, like stuff I'd never thought that I would do again, because of this work and because of getting out of that state of chronic threat. And when that happens, that resets your nervous system and allows you to connect more frequently with the rest and digest response, which is kind of allowing your body to access that more equilibrium state and being able to access the alert response, the threat response when you need to, but the majority of the time being in that rest and digest response where you can digest properly, you can metabolize your food, you can sleep, you can connect with others, you can breathe deeper, all of these things that come along with being in that state of rest and digest. So that's what I teach now. And I do it specifically to help people with chronic illnesses, but I also now actually this year launched a program to help people who are just going through stressful times, like stressful events. You know, we all have, right? Post 2020, if anything, we've all lived through a very traumatic event. And so what was happening was a lot of my clients were reaching out and saying, well, I want to give something to my brother-in-law who just got fired from his job, or I want to use some of these tools with my kids who are figuring out, you know, how to be in a social setting post-COVID. So I created a program for people going through life transitions that are undergoing a high amount of stress. And so that's pretty much what I work with, is that physiological stress response. And I've now been doing it 7 years. And it's been really cool to just be niched down, you know, into just addressing the nervous system. It's such a big part of healing, but such a missing part of healing too.
Yeah, I follow so much of your content, and I know you're saying niche down, but I mean, I don't know if I scroll through 30 posts, like it connects to everything. I mean, when you talk about stress, I mean, I know you're saying life transitions, but I'm like, stress is like the number one thing that like gets people, right? Like coupled with anxiety, and anxiety can be from just inflation of prices and struggle to put food on the table to certainly COVID or health issues. I don't know. Just it's when you were talking, it seems like there's such a practicality of what you do that could be applied across the masses. It seems like everybody could use like brain retraining in one way or another. You also have an extensive amount of like, I don't know if like, yeah, I guess like academic like knowledge on this. Like you've got a couple degrees on this. Like you have some certificate. Can you just touch on those like different, I guess, tools that you have that have like helped you become an expert at this?
Yeah, a lot of it was just through, my own personal experience. And so I, studied molecular biology. That's what my bachelor's degree is in. And I did a lot of that research in labs when I was in college, mostly studying like fatty acid ratios, kind of getting into more of the molecular piece of things rather than just the anatomical. And then I went to grad school and I got my master's in physician's assistant studies at Mass College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. And so I learned a lot about the body and how the body works and how the body responds. And this concept of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change and the malleability of the brain, it was probably covered like one day in school, in grad school. And, a great concept, but the application piece was missing. So that's why it was such an aha moment when I went through my own journey of discovering what else was there aside from more of that kind of typical Western medical model. So I got into it. I started to apply the techniques myself, and then I started to study some other techniques in various programs. I became certified in neuro linguistic programming or NLP techniques. I also became a practitioner in the emotional freedom technique and thought field therapy. So I started to learn about a lot of the concepts that really help to shift and change our physiology. And that's like the thing that we're doing all the time. And so like you mentioned, like everyone can use brain retraining. It's like we're all brain retrainers, every single person, because when we turn on the TV or listen to a podcast episode, we're literally training our brains. Like our brains are literally changing. So when I wanted to study this information, my thought was, how do we change our brains to benefit us? Like, how do we access the physiology that we want to experience? And that's why you see me like on social media talking about really simple things, like walking down the street and smiling for 1 minute and maybe looking like a crazy person and your neighbor's like, what is she on? But when you do that, you can increase dopamine in your body. And when you increase dopamine, you naturally increase your motivation and your focus. And so there's so many little tricks like that, and also really specific protocols you can start to use to access the physiology that you want to experience, that makes you feel good, or ultimately makes you feel good enough to then process traumatic events that have happened to you, or sit with the nooks and crannies of what makes you you, like you on your bad days. Those times when you're accessing that different neurochemistry, that different physiology, there are moments in time where you can now have that evidence for change. So on those bad days, or when you have experienced a traumatic event, because that's part of life, we use our ability to be flexible and access different neurochemistry to our benefit, so we don't stay stuck in that state of chronic stress. And so it's this all added effect. And I think there has been a lot of confusion around like toxic positivity culture. Like, oh, why would I smile if I'm not feeling like smiling? Well, the idea isn't that you override negative emotions. It's that you equally express positive, if anything, equally express positive and negative emotions, so that during those times where you inevitably have a negative emotion, you're able to move through it with more ease without getting stuck and staying there, which, as we know, can lead to, depression, anxiety disorders, and a lot of other chronic conditions.
Yeah, I like to always think of it like maybe silly the way I describe this, but I'm young enough to remember like the Batman commercials, and he had like a utility belt on, and he always had like these gadgets that were so cool as a kid. And I always think about, the more you learn about how to take care of yourself, it's sort of like figuring out all the tools that you could use. And it's just having a really wide repertoire of tools, maybe it's a nature walk, maybe it's exercise, maybe to your point, it's smiling or the grounding technique. I mean, there's just so many of them out there. And I don't know, I got a little guy and I'm always trying to teach him like, there's all these tools and you should learn enough about what the tool does and how it can benefit you. And then like in the moment, you can try on different tools to help you navigate the situation. That's sort of how I think of like all these different things. Because to your point, these tools don't help you. They don't circumvent bad situations. Like we're all going to be faced with adversity, whether it's on a personal, a professional level, a global level. But it's how we cope with those situations when they pop up. So I don't know. Every time I like read, even the videos you shared on the standard, I think you had like a grounding technique in there, and then there was another one you did in the morning. I'm like, these are just tools that you can try on and see if they work for you in that moment, and they may provide a little bit of balance or more resiliency to help you get through it.
I
Sort of the
think
way I think of it.
too, absolutely. But I think an important thing to point out is, yes, like a lot of those like quick tools, like I share on the standard or on TikTok or whatever, it can be like really helpful in the moment to help you cope.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is we, as a society, need to arm ourselves with Batman's gadgets ahead of the traumatic events. And we
Oh
need
yeah.
to model to ourselves and our kids and our communities safety, safety, safety. Safety, connection, authenticity, like a lot of the core needs that we as humans have. We need to, like, the reason why I have programs developed is because, yeah, you can smile or you can ground and you can do these incredible tools in the moment. But if you're not overall modeling your core needs to yourself, prioritizing those things in a way that's really genuine to you, whether that's changing your lifestyle or changing the way you connect with others, or for what I teach, a lot of times it's structured protocols using visualization techniques to connect with what that feeling of perhaps safety feels like in your body. These are the tools we need now. These are the tools we need to model to our kids so that they can be like, oh, yeah, okay, yes. In that moment when I'm experiencing fear, because we all experience fear at some point, I can breathe through it. Yes, I can do one of my tools in it in the moment. But I also have this evidence for resilience as a whole, for meeting my needs every single freaking day, prioritizing that connection, prioritizing authenticity, prioritizing safety, so that by the time that event happens, I've got my gadgets and I'm like, I'm here. I'm not operating at like a 5% or a 10%. I'm like
Yeah.
coming out battery charged. I've prioritized this. I've set the tone and the intention every day. And now I'm showing up as I am. And that, I think, is the bigger piece that's
Yeah.
missing when it comes to just talking about nervous system regulation as a whole.
No, I love that. Role model the way, as they say. Well, let's dive into you a little bit. So there's two sort of core components to this. There's one sort of looking at like a fundamental habit that supports your mental health and your well-being, and then we'll pivot over to looking at like a mindset that does. But we'll start off with the habit part of it. Is there one habit from your perspective that really supports you at this stage of your life above the rest? And sort of, you can look at it from a mental health or a wellness perspective, but one habit that really helps you at this moment.
Yeah, a big habit that I implemented this year with my husband while we're traveling on the road, which has been so helpful. We took a class with Alea Dow, who's the author of Seven Cups of Consciousness, and she and her husband did this class together, and my husband and I took it. And the premise of it is setting intention first thing in the morning, which is kind of the overarching like goal, but then doing it in this structured way. And I absolutely love this. This is like my favorite habit right now. So basically, what we'll do is a check-in exercise first thing in the morning. And we usually do it while we're lying in bed. And each person like gets their minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, however long, to kind of check in. And so the idea is you check in emotionally. Okay, hey, how are you feeling this morning? And then you talk about it. You talk about how you're feeling emotionally. Again, like, emotions don't define your personality. Emotions are energy in motion, right? And we move through emotions all the time. So, okay, well, I'm feeling, excited about the day, but I'm a little bit nervous about this thing, or, whatever. And we each spend our time doing that and talking about our emotions. We do emotions, then we set an intention for the day. So, what's your intention for the day? Well, my intention is self compassion, or my intention is to be open, whatever that intention is. And then we also so there's three things. So, we check in about the emotions, set our intention, and then we talk about what percentage are you at today? And so this was actually a technique derived from Brene Brown, saying like it's not a 50-50 in a partnership. We're not always coming at things in a 50-50 way. But this in general has helped my relationship, but also helped me to check in with myself and how I'm feeling and like where I'm coming from. So for example, you could wake up, maybe you had a crappy night of sleep, and you're kind of anxious about the day, and you're like at a 40% or a 35%. And then the other person talks about their emotions, their intention, and their percentage, like what they're coming at today as far as like energy and presence goes. And that could be a 60%. So that at that point, it's like, okay, thank you. Like, your batteries are charged. Like, how can you support me today? Right? If we know that person's coming from a 60%, the other person is at a 35%. And the idea is, if you're ever less than 100%, you come up with a contingency plan. So if like my husband and I are both at 40%, and we're like, all right, what can we cancel today? What can we outsource? What meals can we get delivered? Like, how can we support ourselves knowing that we're starting out like this? It doesn't mean the rest of the day we're going to be at that percentage, but it really helps sets the tone. And then personally, what I found is, if I ever feel like lost or unfocused or unmotivated during the day, I always come back to my intention and I ask myself, what is one way that I can practice self-compassion, that I can practice being open, whatever, in this moment. And this practice in general, like, I love morning practices, as I talk about on the standard, just because that is when we have the most motivation, because of the circadian rhythm and because of the neurochemistry that we're expressing. Being able to do that first thing in the morning does set your day up for intention and focus. And so when you find yourself getting sleepy or whatever it is throughout the day, like I always come back to that moment and I do a quick check-in in that moment myself. So that's been a huge habit. We've been doing that for 9 months, and it has been life-changing, and it has definitely brought us closer to as a couple and helps us to know, like, it's like marriage is a partnership. It's like, no, now we're partners. We're like, locking arms. We're like, we got this. We're going to pull each other through. Like, how can we support each other? So it's been an incredible habit. Yeah.
I love that. It made me think when you were saying that a handful of years ago, I love quotes. And so a handful of years ago, I tried to distill my life down to like a set of quotes. So I had 21 of them and I put them up on my wall and I was like, they best reflect my values and sort of help me recenter my focus on a day by day. And one of those quotes is keep your attention on your intention.
Mm-hmm.
Which I was thinking about when you were saying that is like, how do you set an intention for the day and then stay focused on that? So I was like, yay, there's one of them. And I love the fact that you do this with your partner. I guess one of the things that I'm asking myself is this being a newer habit, why did you start this? Like, I know it's 9 months in the making, but why did you choose to start this practice each morning?
A big reason why we signed up for the course, to begin with, which is the course itself was called The Path of the Power Couple. And one of the reasons why we signed up for that course to begin with is to develop our communication skills. And we've always had like a really great relationship. We've always been able to communicate. We're both very growth oriented, and that was huge. Like, that is what makes us, uh, a great partnership. And so we wanted to take our communication to the next level, and especially living on the road this year and spending so much time together, you learn everything there is about that person. It's like the first 3 months of being on the road. My husband Kavika, he's like, "Wow, you work so much." I'm like, "What do you think that I was doing in my office for all those years?" Like, he's like, "Well, I don't know, but like, I'm just so impressed." And so we spent like the first part of this year like really getting to know the ins and outs of the person, like basically seeing them all the time, or at least knowing what they're doing all the time. And as a result, like, we needed to learn how to now cohabitate from this new relationship. And honestly, like, if you've never tried living on the road, it is like a microcosm for life. There are so many things that you cannot control. Like, it just started to rain here and it was just bright and sunny skies. My dog is like outside right now, probably like crying in the rain. Like, there's so many things you cannot control. And what I always like come back to in my own practice and vital side is, okay, well, what is possible for me? Not so much what can I control, but what is possible for me? And I reach my hands out and kind of wrap them around me, because it is really only you, your energy that exists around you and inside of you. That is all you have control over. So, this habit that we started to create and this course that we took was so that we could get really clear on what's going on inside of us, to learn how to best communicate with one another. That's just one tool. We've learned so many tools because you can easily move through emotions, whether it's on the road or at home: frustration, anger, sadness, confusion. And we've learned to move through those emotions in a really effective way. And it was it's necessary for us both being growth minded, but it's been such a blessing like being within a living in a 27-foot trailer together, to have those skills. Like, it has changed a lot, and honestly, we're closer than ever now that we have a lot of these skills that we put into practice.
Is there ever a morning that you guys don't practice this, or?
We do it every morning. The only morning I can think of was like, we skipped it this past Sunday because we woke up and immediately we were on a hike. And I even had this moment where we were off-roading through the Great Sand Dunes in Colorado. And we do a lot of hiking, a lot of nature time. And I remember driving to this place that we were going to go like climb up the sand dune. And I remember thinking like, oh, we didn't do our check-in this morning. And part of me felt guilty, but whenever I do feel that guilt, I come back to this idea like, this is all for me. This is all for growth. So even if we skip a day because we're being present, like that's totally fine. I don't personally like rigidity. So to say I have to do something the same way every single day, I think is an expectation where you're setting yourself up for failure. And so in that moment, I was like, nope, I'll just come back to it tomorrow. And we did. And we've done it every day since. And we'll continue to do it, as often as we can.
No, I love that. I think it's so hard. I know I struggle with it. Is like if you say you're going to do something, and habits in some ways are meant to be automatic. There's you could argue whether they should be more conscious or unconscious. I think there's value in both, but I think it's how do you be less judgmental, have a little bit more compassion when maybe you had planned to do something that it didn't actually happen. I think a lot about exercise in that way. If you say you're going to go to the gym or you're going to go for a walk or practice in your journal, if you don't actually do that particular activity, how does that make you feel? And how do you accept that? And I think you said it brilliant there. I haven't heard it that way. Is you're doing it for you, so there's no need to beat yourself up about not doing it in that moment based on a circumstance or whatnot.
And one way I like to reframe that is like, for what you're mentioning, like exercise journaling, like to me, that is under the umbrella term of self-care. Say that you're going to do one thing of self-care every day. It can be the same time every day, but personally,
Mm-hmm.
one of my top core values is freedom and spontaneity. So, hence I'm living on the road and sometimes don't even know where I'm going the next day. But if like that is the habit, self-care is the habit. Because what happens is if you say, I'm going to drink this smoothie every single day, or I'm going to exercise in this way every single day, we get into these addictions, these negative addictions that I have to do it in this way. And if I don't, it's almost like, something bad is going to happen or I'm not showing up. And then the question becomes, well, why are you doing this in the first place? If you instead look at a habit from the term of like self-care and commit to doing something for self-care every day, that'll give you the flexibility to like, okay, well, I'm going to journal for 5 minutes, or I'm going to go for a hike for 4 hours, like then it leaves room for that piece of freedom, which to me and to a lot of people is that top core value. And so if I don't have that freedom, I feel like I'm being put into a box. Not everyone's like that. Some people like that more regimented and structured approach, but that's not really what I like to talk about because we're human and we fail. And that's a part of being human, and that's totally okay. So yeah, create a habit, but don't put yourself in a box when it comes to like what exactly that habit should look like.
Yeah, I had two wonderful ladies, Freya Mortensen, who's an empath coach, and Vasya Sarantopoulos, who follows you as well. She's out of the Netherlands. And I remember their episodes because they brought up the idea of self-compassion a lot, and Freya was talking a lot about intuition. And I remember I'm like, so you just wake up and if you don't feel like doing something, you just follow your intuition. And I mean, I was just stuck on it for like 10 minutes. And I've actually tried to selfishly, what I love about this podcast is like, I get to listen to all these experts and then I'm like, maybe I don't exactly have it right all the time. Maybe I can recalibrate some of the ways that I approach it. And I've tried to embrace remove some of the rigidity and the way that I move. Still in practice to be determined how that all pans out. I'm curious, the last question I have on this before we flip over to your mindset. You mentioned that this is a habit that you started, if I heard you correctly, was to be better communicators. Did you guys start this habit when you say better communicators, was it with yourself? Was it with each other? Like, was some of the spirit of developing this habit was to strengthen your relationship initially?
It's always about self, and then after self, everything else kind of starts to
Okay.
fall into place. So, this course that we took in particular was specific to the relationship, but like the first 2 weeks were all about yourself. Like, it's all
Yeah.
about connecting into yourself, because I'm a lot like you. Like, I can wake up with that really masculine energy of like, these are the things that I'm going to do today because they are on my schedule and because of X, Y, and Z. And that's my go to. And that prevents me from checking in with myself. How am I feeling? Kind of that
Mhm.
more feminine energy. And I think a lot of us are guilty of doing that. And so this habit in particular, like the way we created it was derived from the course and like Brene Brown's work, but we've kind of made it our own. But it is first and foremost
Yeah.
for self. And I say that with like, you know, just very in this like very powerful way of like it does start within. It always starts within. So if you're ever thinking it's someone else's problem, or it's the other person in the relationship, no, it always starts inside. And so getting really connected with the possibility that exists for you, what you do have control over, and then being able to have the tools to use to connect inward and understand yourself better, but then learning then how to use those skills in a relationship. And it has like, you know, improved our relationship so much. And we didn't think you know, we didn't go in, we're like, we need to get our relationship right. We're like, wow, this is incredible, because now I personally understand how to move through an emotion or how to check in with myself and then apply it to communicating with my partner. So even this work, like what I teach, nervous system regulation, it's like, yeah, it's to calm the stress response. Yeah, this work that I'm talking about here to kind of go inward and to connect with your needs, but it's just one avenue to impact every single thing around you: your relationship, your career, your family life, your friendships, how you set boundaries, how you show up in the world. Like, everything gets impacted in this domino effect. So that's why, Kavika and I have always shared that growth. It's like growth number one. And it helps to improve, every piece of your life, which is really, really cool.
Yeah, such a positive ripple effect when you take care of yourself. Let's pivot over to mindset. So, in a similar vein, is like, I'm so curious what you'll say here, but is there a mindset that at this stage of where you're at in your life that really contributes the most to your mental health, your well being, your success?
One thing that I have learned that I've loved to do, like, especially within these last 5 years of my life, is like learn more about myself and learn how and why I respond in certain ways and things like that. And I think, you know, there is maybe some confusion around mindset work, is like, I should show up as this happy person, or I should show up in this way. And to me, what's been so important as far as mindset goes is understanding me and my core values. We talked about freedom, we talked about core needs like safety and respect. But one word that has kind of been highlighted, like up on the wall, like illuminated in every aspect of my life, that I just learned the word this year, even though if I look at every situation in my life it applied to, uh, it's integrity. And integrity, now that I have learned that this word is what forms my relationships, is what chooses like my professional career, my partner, my friends, I have been able to just stick true to myself and understand like, oh, like everything else makes sense. I think of like when I was dealing with Lyme disease after working as a PA, being super, travel oriented, adventurous, on the go, then getting my whole world like squashed, having my freedom limited, and then getting to the place where I'm like, can I go back to Western medicine? And the reason why I said no to that was because of integrity. No, I found this alternative route that helps to, is like the missing piece for a lot of people in their healing journey. And it helps you to connect inward and connect with yourself. I'm going to go with that because of integrity. That made the most sense to me in that moment. That felt the most authentic. And so if I ever find myself like getting peeved in a relationship, maybe a professional relationship, we don't see eye to eye, I say, is this because the situation's not matching with the integrity that I prioritize in my life? And the answer is always yes. And it happens all the time. So as far as mindset goes, I think a big piece of it is starting to understand yourself. And a lot of that means doing the work, sitting with yourself, sitting quietly, connecting with yourself, whether that's in a spiritual way or in a meditative way, or simply kind of honing in on, focus skills, like whatever that means to you. There's so many routes to go down, but getting to know yourself and then staying true to who that is. So now that I know that word, I'm like, I keep it like at the top of my head. So if I'm in conversation with someone and I'm like, this isn't matching like my integrity, next, like move on, set a boundary. And I think that determines a lot of just kind of having that mindset piece of like, I'm going to prioritize what is the most authentic thing to me, and then make choices in my life, set boundaries in my life to support that. And I think that is one of the biggest things that you can possibly do in order to connect with yourself, because I think the mindset work that we know has changed drastically in the last decade, because it's become less about what you should feel and how you should experience your life. And now it's like all about you and understanding like your bio individuality and your needs and who you are. And I think as we get to know ourselves better, it can really help us to determine how we feel and how we show up in the world. And I know personally that's been so helpful in my career, my relationship, how I'm living on the road, like all of these things.
I love that. I was reading your post earlier on your birthday post on the things that you learned, and I don't know, as you were talking, it just reminded me of all the points that you were making there. I'm hoping you can elaborate a little bit on, you mentioned the doing the hard work. And I don't know, when I talk to people, I think that concept is, I don't think it's hard. I think people shy away from it a little bit. I don't know. I always get the impression that there's a fair amount of people in society that don't want to, I guess let's say, look themselves in the mirror and be honest. So when you're doing this hard work, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, it's such an individualized question, because like I can answer it, but I can tell you right now my path isn't going to be for maybe 80% of the people
For sure.
listening. Like
Yeah, for
everyone
sure. For sure.
has got their own path. And it's interesting because the work started with nervous system regulation. My body was burnt out. So I had to learn the tools to learn to regulate my nervous system, get out of this state of threat. That was the first step. After a couple years of that, and then getting to the place, it took me about a year to get back to my health. And then I became physically strong again. Then I challenged myself physically in any way I could, walking across hot coals, jumping out of planes, like doing all these things physically where I was like, I'm going to see if I can do this. This is my journey. Okay. So that was like about another year of doing those things. Then I was like, okay, now I'm physically strong, I'm physically well. Now I'm going to dive into deep trauma processing because I tried a little bit of that, and I was in therapy for about a decade on and off throughout my young adult years, and, growing up and being abused as a child. And so you tend to be put into therapy when situations like that occur. And I had done some talk therapy and stuff for a big part of my life, but now I was an adult. I've tested my body physically. I've got that strength. My nervous system is regulated. Then I started doing trauma processing therapy, processing traumatic events. So for me, that looked like doing EMDR for about a year, and super helpful. From there, I experimented with other modalities. I was with a trained therapist who used some, different types of modalities. So, somatic practices I have used, um, some more kind of spiritual ones. I have done like drug induced therapies with psilocybin and MDMA. So I tried a lot. I'm very much like a person, and I love like trying things also. When people ask me if I tried something, I'm like, yes. I love having feedback for those things. And so I did a lot of them myself, the ones that fall under that bucket of trauma processing. But it was really because I was at a place where I felt regulated enough, strong enough to address those things. And then when I was feeling really well, it was almost like an overnight switch. I started to get insomnia. And it was almost as if like my body was like, you're missing something else. So then I had started to address the trauma processing, and then I also started to find out what spirituality meant to me. So it was like this, it was like I had to address one thing at a time. So now, like this year in particular, I don't do any regular trauma processing. It's more about discovering my own spirituality and doing spiritual practices, a lot of like energetic work. That's what makes the most sense to me. And so, like, you talk about how you're like, oh, I need to change my habits or my rigidity. It's like we're changing all the time. And like what I was focused on 3 years ago is so different from what I'm focused on now. And that's an amazing thing. Like that to me is like, again, prioritizing growth and change, because we're always growing and changing. We're constantly evolving. So letting ourselves do that, and that's where I'm at today. So that's what doing the work means. And today, doing that kind of work after going through some of those more intensive therapies, to me looks like going through deep meditations. Every day I meditate. Every day I move my body. I have a variety of different meditations I use, energetic practices, and uh, that's how it looks like to me today.
I love the fact that you've acknowledged that it changes over time. I'm curious, has there been a moment along this journey of trying all these different things where you knew you needed to try something new, but there was resistance to trying something new? Like, was there ever a moment that you were, I guess, stuck in your ways and you were unwilling to lean into a different direction?
Not unwilling, but definitely resistant. But that's normal, that fear. You know, fear is meant to keep us alive, our hearts beating. So when something new and different presents itself and that resistance occurs, that's a result of your body or your brain trying to protect you from
Right.
dying, right? And wanting to keep you alive. So it never stopped me. And that's always been huge for me. is not letting fear dictate my behavior. I've been scared, I've been resistant, but how I live my life is never based on fear. So no, it has never prevented me from moving forward. And I think a big part of that is reframing the resistance of like, oh, this resistance is trying to protect me. Thank you for trying to protect me and trying to keep me safe. But you're not going to determine how I live my life, because you're like in the back seat of this car that I'm driving. That is my life. So I am very action oriented, and I love to follow through, and I love to do, um, even if it's not always the right thing or like the best thing. To me, it always is so worth it to do and to try and to fail or to succeed.
That's great. Last question I got on this: when you mentioned mindset, you mentioned integrity, and the way that I took that is being true to your values, whatever those values are. Is it safe to assume your values change over time, like as you develop and experience new things, and as you get older, and um, those values, I would imagine, to some extent, are moving targets, are they not? Or
Yeah, in my practice, what I've kind of learned is a lot of the core values that we have don't change, but they get rearranged. So, for example, if you run through an NLP exercise and you determine your top 10 core values, it's likely those were developed from a very young age because they were likely values that you saw in other people or saw that you needed as a result of events that have happened in your life. And we kind of commit those values almost to the subconscious when we're very young. And then we move through our lives living by those core values without having that conscious awareness of them.
mm,
And what I have found for the most part, maybe a couple can change. Maybe you add one or two, but for the most part, those top 10 are going to be the same. But different stages of life will prioritize different needs. Perhaps when you're ready to get married or get into a serious partnership, maybe it's safety. That's like number one for you. Maybe when you're kind of like young and traveling and, moving and doing like lots of different things, maybe it's freedom. But it's likely that was still number 5 or 6 or 8 sometime in your life. And now they're just getting reordered, just depending on the season of life you're in. And maybe it'll be brought up again, at a later time when you want to again experience freedom when you're, 70 years old and going for another travel experience around the world. And that's number one. But it was likely there and formed from a very young age.
interesting. I like that. Last question I got for you, Lindsay. So we focus so much on this, on the individual, but so much of my curiosity is how working on yourself, if we all did this, can have a very positive effect on humanity. And so this is a more of an aspirational type question, but if, when you think of all the challenges that we face as a society, if you could wave a wand and distill down some mindset or habit that all of humanity would embrace, is there one habit or mindset that you feel would nudge us in a more loving and kind direction?
I think intention. I think setting intention, because that not only impacts mindset, it impacts your nervous system, it impacts everyone and everything around you. If we were more intentional with what we said, how we spent time, the relationships that we have, checking in with ourselves, understanding ourselves a little bit better, the whole world can then be more connected, can be safer, can be a lot easier to live in. And intention, that's been a huge priority in my marriage this year. And as a result, or because of, it has been prioritized within myself. And I hope to convey that to everyone I work with, my friends, my clients, my peers, all of these different people. If we're much more intentional, our entire world can change. And it's a beautiful thing because intention allows you to have a choice so that you start to feel in control of your life and less chaotic and less overwhelmed. And we could all use a little bit of that right now.
Yeah, well said. Lindsay, you've been great. Where can people go to learn more about you?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram or TikTok. I've got a lot of free resources there at my vital side. And you can also check out my newest program, Reboot. I'm offering all the listeners here a discount, 20% discount off your first 3 months. And Reboot is just a basic daily practice to start regulating your nervous system after experiencing a stressful event. So yeah, I will provide you with that link here in the show notes.
Awesome. And you have a podcast, correct?
I do. It's called Rewire the Podcast, and we talk all about nervous system regulation from a day-to-day perspective, me and my co-host, Kate Murphy.
Awesome. Well, we will include all of that in the show notes. Lindsay, you, unsurprising, have been wonderful. I love all of the wisdom that you have, and your energy is phenomenal. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing a little bit more about yourself.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I've loved being here today.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Standard. Before we go, click on the link in the show notes of this episode to learn more about today's guest. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with somebody who you think would benefit from it as well.